And it was my pleasure to be here. I really enjoy having some time to share some history with you.
Excuse me, is
That's
that coming
feedback.
from, is it from here or
There.
there?
I'm trying to fix it because it was too loud.
I can fix
We
it.
moved the microphone
Am
to
I-
the other side.
Am I doing?
Over on the other side, Lloyd?
Yeah.
You gotta fix it now, Laura.
I'll fix it. Let's see. Oh,
Alice fixing it.
Alice, okay, it was over on the other side. Oh, okay.
I think
Well,
he's.
we can,
Can I just hold it?
yeah.
Could it work better?
No, it should work fine that way. Just bend it a little towards you.
Will this work better?
Oh, yeah.
Great.
Right? Okay. Turns out that Abraham Lincoln gave a really great speech when he was inaugurated for his second term. And many of you know what that speech says, but I want to just review for you some of his most famous words. He said, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." I know that sounds pretty good now. Back when he was inaugurated, there were many people in the North that disagreed with that. They thought it was time for vengeance against the South. And I want to read to you a little bit of history written about that time. After the Lincoln assassination on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, the people came flocking back to their churches on Easter Sunday, known as Black Easter, seeking whatever explanation there might be for the mysterious actions of God. The preachers gave them the perfect excuse for revenge against the South and John Wilkes Booth, and a reason why Boston Corbett should be viewed as a national hero. Many, perhaps hundreds of clergymen explained that God had removed Lincoln because he had been too merciful toward the Southerners. And when I tell people about that, oftentimes they doubt what I've just read. So I was able to find some excerpts from some of the sermons that were given on Black Friday. I found a lot of them, but I just picked out a few here. "May it not be," said the Reverend Joel E. Rockwell, pastor of the Central Presbyterian Church of Brooklyn, "that God has permitted this great crime to awaken us to a sense of justice and to full extraction of God's law upon those who planned and accomplished this horrible scenes the past 4 years." The Reverend George Peavy in the Church of Puritans, New York City, "God had caused this assassination to take place toward the end of a week so that Sunday's sermons might the better instruct the nation in the proper moral. God has a purpose in permitting this great evil," said the Reverend D.S. Brown, Church of Troy, New York. And finally, "I accept God's action as an indication that Lincoln's work as an instrument of providence called here." So, I think maybe it's time for me to just tell you a little bit about Boston Corbett, which leads up to this time of history. He was born in England in 1832. His family, his parents, he came to the United States when he was 7 years old. And he must have been a pretty smart kid because in a relatively short time, he was able to apprentice into the hat making industry, and he became what's known as a hatter. And hatters in those days were pretty important. They actually all had little cards they carried around, sort of like business cards, to show that they were hatters. And the hatters worked in an assembly line. It was interesting work. And they would start at one end and pass the hats all down the line. When they got to the other end, they would be finished. So it was really a considerably good job. When he was about 17, he'd had enough money and had done well for himself that he got married. Well, his first tragedy of his life struck then. His wife got pregnant and died during childbirth. So there he was, 18 or 19 years old, and it was hard for him to take, and he turned to drink. He still was able to keep his job, but for a number of years he wandered around. He went from city to city, still being a hatter, and he finally ended up in Boston. And when he was 26 years old, he was walking down the street, and he happened to hear some evangelists talking, and he stopped to listen to them, and right on the spot, he was saved. And he gave up all the liquor and the booze and became a born-again Christian. He searched around for a church that he thought he'd like to join, and he picked a Methodist. Well, he was pretty fiery. He was only 5 feet 4 inches tall, but remember, back in those days, that's not short. Lots of people were that height then. But he had a booming voice. And so when he was going around with the people preaching the word of the Lord, he oftentimes spoke out when he shouldn't, and spoke out loudly when he shouldn't. So finally the other guy said to him, look, we think you ought to maybe do this by yourself. And he said, okay. And about that time he said, well, Jesus renamed his disciples, and I think I should be renamed too. Up until that time, he was Thomas P. Corbett. And then he decided to name himself after the city where he was saved. So then he became legal, actually, Boston Corbett from then on. And that's it. And hardly anybody even knows about him. Well, anyway, about that time, when he was 26, he began to show that he wasn't quite a normal person. And after reading some parts of the Bible, he began to take some of them a little too seriously. And one time when he was talking on the corner, 2 prostitutes approached him. He felt lust for these 2 ladies, and to do something about it, he went home and he mutilated himself. Now, I don't want to talk about that. I just want you to know that this was a big turning point in his life. If you're interested in knowing what he did and an explanation of Matthew 19, 11, 12, I have a handout over on the table over there, and you can pick it up and read that. But I didn't want to talk about what he had done to himself. Anyway, it took him a couple of weeks to recover, but then he went back to his preaching. And for the next 3 years, he pretty much behaved himself. But when he was 29, the Civil War broke out. And he had to make a choice, kind of whether to be a soldier or a pacifist, and he chose being a soldier. And it turns out that he was a really good one. The only problem the military had with him, he enlisted for 2 years, and he would stop doing whatever he was doing, didn't matter what it was. If somebody said some words that he didn't accept, he'd fall to his knees and start praying. So they called him the glory to God man. And sometimes they had enough of him and they would throw him in jail. But he didn't mind. He liked being in jail. All those prisoners were there, and he could save all their souls. And so he just preached up a storm. And finally they would let him out, But he had a distinguished service. But when his 2 years are up, he went to his commanding officer and said, my 2 years are up tonight. And they said, no, you still got about 4 months to serve. Well, that didn't mean anything to Boston Corbett. When it was 12 o'clock, he was on sentry duty. 12 o'clock, time to leave the army, and he just walked off duty, went to his tent, and started packing up stuff. Well, they arrested him, charged him with desertion, which was true, of course, and they sentenced him to be shot. Well, one of his officers that he had knew he was a really great soldier, so he intervened, and Abraham Lincoln signed a pardon for him. So, of course, he wasn't in the army anymore, which didn't bother him. He just re-enlisted. And so he could still continue with his preaching. Well, one of the battles he was in, which is really interesting, there was a an army group in the South called Mosby's Raiders, and they were really a tough bunch of guys and some of the best servicemen in the South. And Boston Corbett's regiment ran into these guys, and Mosby's Raiders were actually better, and some of the Boston Corbett's fellow soldiers got away. Many of them were killed, but he didn't run away. He stayed there until he used all the ammunition from his rifle, all the ammunition from his pistol. Then he grabbed his rifle and charged him. He was going to club him to death. Anyway, the soldiers there were going to kill him, of course, until Mosby stepped in. Captain Mosby stepped in and said, "Wait a minute, this guy is a whale of a soldier. We're not going to kill this guy. You know, he'd spare his life." So then they sent him to Andersonville Prison in Georgia, which was a really, really bad place. But while he was there, he had all these prisoners to save their souls. So he became a really great glory to God man there. But then he began to realize that maybe this wasn't what he should do as a soldier, so he escaped. Well, it didn't last long. They sent out the greyhounds the hound dogs after him, and caught him, brought him back. And by then, he was in pretty bad shape. He was just skin and bones, and his health was bad. And so there were prisoner exchanges. So the South decided, look, this guy's nothing but trouble for us, we'll exchange him. So Boston Corbett was exchanged, and as soon as he got exchanged, he went to the Army hospital. And he was there about a month trying to get himself back in shape. Well, about that time is when Lincoln was elected for the second time. Because Boston had to join the Army again. So he joined the Army again and was assigned to the New York 16th. And that was when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. And Boston Corbett happened to be, they had troops all over the place, of course, but he happened to be in the group that chased down John Wilkes Booth. And they caught him in a barn. And Booth and his companion, David Harold, said they wouldn't come out of the barn. They tried to negotiate an escape plan. But the Army, of course, wasn't going to have any of that. David Harold finally came out of the barn, and John Wilkes Booth said, you know, I'm not coming out. So the officers said, well, we'll force him out. So they lit the barn on fire. Well, while the fire was burning, Boston Corbett could see through the cracks in the barn, because this was a tobacco barn, and they have slits in them so the tobacco can dry out. He could look through there and see John Wilkes Booth. And he described it how he took out his pistol, leaned it on his arm, and took a shot. And it was an amazing thing, because the shot that killed John Wilkes Booth hit him in his head, almost the exact place that the shot that had killed Abraham Lincoln. And of course, immediately, Boston Corbett and other people said, that bullet must have been guided by God. Boston Corbett said, glory to God, man, that God had directed his actions. Well, the officers were really upset, because at first they said nobody was supposed to fire. He was supposed to be taken alive. But when this was all over with, and they all got back to Washington and they had trials, at that time, then the stories changed a little bit. When these guys had to tell the truth under oath, they had to admit that they hadn't given any orders not to fire. And of course, Boston Corbett was an instant celebrity. I mean, they had pictures of his pictures were selling as much as Grant and Sheridan. I mean, he was famous, and of course, he was interviewed time after time. And in the beginning, he talked about the barn incident and the Andersonville incident, but after a while, he changed so that every time he talked, it was a religious talk. And it wasn't long before people didn't want to have him come speak to him anymore, and things began to die down. You know how that goes. Things are news for a while, but not for very long. And then things really changed, because Booth had a lot of friends. And there were a lot of people in the South that thought that Boston Corbett ought to maybe he ought to die. So they began sending him threatening letters. And now he had always carried his pistol. By the way, I have some handouts over the table over there. This is a handout that shows the gun and Boston Corbett. If any of you are interested in having this little history, you can pick one of those up over there. And then this is the handout of the quotes that I gave. And so he always carried these guns, sometimes stuck in his belt, sometimes stuck in his boot. Well, he got sort of paranoid, and sometimes when he would go some places to give a talk, he wouldn't talk about what they wanted him to talk about. And so they would, say, you're not doing what you're supposed to. And he'd whip out his guns and threaten people. Well, that went on for a few years, actually. 10 or 12 years. So eventually he said, this isn't working, I'm getting out of here. So he left Washington. By the way, I should tell you, all the time that he lived before that, when he was in Boston, when he was in Washington, he always lived very sparsely. Small rooms, he usually ate one good meal a day. And then in the evenings, he almost always had his Methodist friends in for big prayer meetings. This one on every night. So when he decided to go to Kansas, and he homesteaded 80 acres there in Concordia, Kansas. You know how it is with history? You can't read one thing because there will be discrepancies from one thing to another. The main point might be the same, but getting to that point might be different because of two different points of view. His home was mostly described as a dugout. Now you all know what a dugout is because you've been to a baseball game, and that's the way they described his home. It was a dugout. Other people described it as a cabin, and some other people described it as a hole in the ground. But whatever it was, he lived there for a number of years, but he was still very paranoid and would whip out his guns at a moment's notice. There are some stories that he actually took some shots at some kids that were bothering him, and there are other stories that said no, he never took shots at anybody. But there was the famous baseball incident, and he was in his buggy riding around in the country, and he ran across a baseball game, and the kids were playing and the parents were all there. This was sinful to him, a baseball game on a Sunday. So he leaped out of the wagon, whipped out his guns, and charged after them. Well, you can imagine what happened. They just scattered all over the place to get away from him, and they reported him, of course. And the next day, the sheriff came out and arrested him. They took him back to Concordia, and they were going to have sort of a trial. And the funny thing is, they never took his guns away from him. He still had his guns in his boots. Anyway, he went in for the trial, and things went okay until the witnesses against him started talking. And they said, yeah, he came out there and he shot us. Well, Boston Corbett jumped up and said, liars, liars, you're all liars, you can't say it about me. And he whipped out the guns. And of course, again, people scattered like everything to get away from him. And then a strange thing happened. The police didn't do anything. They didn't charge him with anything. They didn't put him in jail. They just let him go home. Well, there were some people that said, look, he killed John Wilkes both. We got to give this guy a little slack. So they said, well, what we'll do is, one of the guys says, what we'll do is I can get a job for him in the state capitol as a doorman and a guard in the legislature. And they offered him that position, and they said they'd give him some money, and he said, okay. Now, the money thing in his life was interesting too. He always seemed to have money. He always paid in cash. But if you read some other accounts of those lives when he was in Concordia, they said he never had any money. His farming wasn't very successful. He tried to get more money out of the veterans, and they wouldn't get him anymore. And so there's two different views on what kind of life he was really leading. I should tell you that after he had shot Booth, there was a huge reward of $50,000. Think of what $50,000 was back in 1865. I mean, it was a lot of money. Well, everybody wanted it, you know. And there were some people who thought Booth ought to get all of it. But the officers involved in this rundown were really against that. And they divided, somebody decided how to divide the money up. And of course, the officers got $5,000 or $6,000 and some of them $10,000. But they did give all of the soldiers who were there, all 25 of them, a split. And so Boston Corbett got $1,653.85. But of course, that must have been used up by the time of the baseball incident. So he went to his new job, and for about a month things went okay, and then something happened, and it's the same old thing about history. Which one of these stories do you want to believe? One of the stories is that there was a prayer going on inside the legislature, and somebody during the prayer said the wrong thing, or somebody inside wasn't paying attention to the prayer, or somebody used some foul language. Whatever it was, he went off again. And one story is that he went into the legislature, locked the doors, whipped out his guns, and began shooting. And the people were jumping under chairs and desks and out windows, and but as luck would have it, or something would have it, he didn't hit anybody. The other story is that he just ran into the room, waved his guns around, didn't fire at anybody, chased everybody out of the building. I don't know how two such stories can be said, but you know how it is when you're listening to people tell the facts. Luckily, there's a lot of facts about Boston Corbett that are written down. Even when he made train trips and things like that, people had to sign their name on tickets and things like that. So people knew a lot about him. Well, anyway, that was too much for them. They said, we can't have this guy doing this. So they sent him to the insane asylum in Topeka, Kansas. Well, he was there about a year, and during that year, of course, he got in some trouble. He had a few fights, and he even stabbed somebody once, and those things are recorded pretty good. But then now comes another part. A group of visitors had come to visit people at the asylum. And they were all on horses and buggies, of course. That's one story. Another story is that a boy came by on a horse and got off to look around. That's another story. The other story is that Boston Corbett and some of the inmates were marching along this road. That's the third story. But what happened, there's no doubt about it, he was a cavalryman. And as soon as he saw a horse that wasn't guarded, he leaped on that thing and took off. And of course, they couldn't catch him. I mean, he knew where he was going because he knew the area. And so he rode his horse to this farmhouse where they had a livery stable. And when he got there, he said, look, I want you people to know that I did not steal this horse. I just borrowed it. So one of the stories is he told them to take it back to the asylum, and the other story is he just wrote a note and left it on the saddle and then let the horse go. But what happened there was interesting. The guy didn't want to keep him there, of course. He'd been there a couple of days, and when he escaped from the asylum, they put all kinds of leaflets out. I mean, you can get copies of those on the internet. Leaflets explaining about this guy and that he was dangerous, and if you see him, watch out. So this guy wanted to get rid of him. So one of the stories is that he gave him some money, gave him a horse, but before he left, the guy's wife came out and said, I think you're really famous, Boston, and I'd like you to address my autograph book. Now, I know that many of you people remember how important autograph books were when you were younger. I mean, almost everybody had one. And as far as we know, That's the last really any proof of where Boston Corbett was, what he was doing. The story after that is two of them. One is that he made it to a train station, and the other one was that he got on a horse and rode away. And that was the end of Boston Corbett. We have absolutely nothing that is true after that. Do I have a couple more minutes?
Take a couple more.
Okay. So, as you can imagine, once he had disappeared, as with every case of an assassination, up comes the people trying to make a little money by having a little of the truth and a lot of lies. So what happened was right away, over a period of the next few years, 3 different men claimed that they were Boston Corbett. One of them was 6 feet tall. And all 3 men were trying the same thing. Convince people they were Boston Corbett and that they wanted their veterans' benefits. Well, none of them got away with it. And then one of the craziest stories is that John Wilkes Booth never died. That he was spirited away out of the Garrett barn, and that was somebody else's body, and that he was traveling around in the Oklahoma area, and that Boston Corbett and he met up in some little town and sat down and had a beer together, I guess, you know. And the guy that claimed he was John Wilkes Booth, or a couple of them did. One of them said he kept quiet for years, but on his deathbed, well, they proved that he wasn't John Wilkes Booth, of course. And then the stories began to surface about Boston Corbett. What had happened to him? Because you got to remember, you can make a fair amount of money in some of the magazines and newspapers in those days if you can come up with just some kind of story they will print. And so one of the stories that they printed was that he died in a fire. There was a big fire there in Kansas, and somebody that was working for the department there had a name of Thomas Corbett, which of course was his original name, so somebody thought, well, this could really be him. But that whole story could just be false. We have no idea. It could just all be wrong. And so, if you think about the fact that it's almost not an end to the story. I mean, according to these people, God had Booth kill Lincoln. God had Corbett kill Booth. And then God forgot about Boston Corbett. He just disappeared. Now, if you have any questions, I'll take them. Anybody got any questions about it? Because I got lots of other things to say, yeah?
Where was the location that John Wilkes Booth was caught and shot?
Well, that was in Virginia, at the Garrett farm. Booth had gone quite a distance. And of course, he was in the South. He wanted to escape. He thought the Southerners would protect him. And that isn't what happened. When he got into the South, most of them didn't want to have anything to do with him because they knew it was nothing but trouble. They did get some information from people that said they had spotted some people on horses and that kind of stuff. And that information led the troops to him, to the Garrett farm. And again, when Booth was shot, they dragged him up on the porch of the Garrett farm, and he lived a couple of hours. He died about the same way that Abraham Lincoln had died, and head across the street from Ford's Theater. Yeah, there were other things going on at this time that were really big events. I mean, they were about ready to execute the conspirators for the Lincoln assassination. There were 4 of them. And they had kept them in very tight watch of them in prison. They didn't want any of them to die. There were people that said, we want Booth alive because we think there was conspiracy in the northern government of some sort. If the results would have been the way the conspirators wanted it, Abraham Lincoln would have died, the vice president would have died, and Secretary of State Seward would have died. Now the guy that was supposed to kill vice president just chickened out and didn't do anything. The guy that was supposed to kill Secretary Stewart actually did attack him. he used his one bullet in his pistol to get into the house, and so then he stabbed Secretary Stewart. And it's a good thing he lived, because he was the guy that bought Alaska for $75 million, which was a really good deal. And so this was going on, so there was a time when these four people, they had three of the conspirators, and Mrs. Surratt, who's ran the boarding house where the conspirators met. So they had three conspirators and Mrs. Surratt, and they had a hanging. And there was all kinds of photographs taken of these people being hung, and lots of other kinds of photographs too. Boston Corbett actually began to tell his story by using lantern slides, and he got pictures of the Lincoln kids and the hanging and that kind of stuff. For those years that he was around Washington after that, he had a lot of information to talk about. And of course, the people in those days, the newspapers was the major source of information. So when they read something in a newspaper, almost always to them, it was the truth. And that's why we have so many stories about what might have happened to them, what might not have happened. But the major points always come down to being the same. I didn't mean to get off the subject to your question.
What happened to the doctor that stabbed his leg?
Well, Dr. Mudd was, when Booth was escaping, he had jumped onto the stage after he shot Lincoln, and he broke his leg. And on getaway, they stopped at a house for him to get his leg set, and the guy that set his leg was Dr. Mudd. Well, when they rounded up all the people involved, they said that Dr. Mudd had helped him escape and knew he was a bad guy, knew what Booth had done, and so they put him in jail. He served quite a bit of time, but while he was in prison, he helped a great deal with medical things with the prisoners, especially with yellow fever. But he eventually was let go, I think, after 20 years or something like that. And then his relatives, after that, spent years trying to prove that Dr. Mudd was really innocent and he didn't know anything about it. And some of you might remember a newscaster named Roger Mudd.
Yes.
Well, he was one of the relatives. And they eventually said that Dr. Mudd was innocent. I don't believe that. From all the things that I can read about it, I think he was in on it. But he did serve some time, but he knew what was going on, along with a lot of other people. Are there any other questions?
Are we going to talk in the other room?
Yes.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Well, look, I really appreciate being here. I really appreciate sharing this information, and I'm glad that you invited me.
Thank you.